If you woke up in ancient Rome tonight, you would probably be dead within a week. Not from war, not from gladiators, from breakfast. And for 500 years, an entire civilization knew this, or felt it at least, and kept going anyway. Rome built a water system that carried mountain springs across valleys and into the heart of the city through the greatest engineering feat the ancient world had ever seen. Those pipes were made of lead. Rome built apartment buildings that housed hundreds of thousands of people across the most densely populated city on Earth. Those buildings collapsed on a regular basis. Rome built sewers that modern engineers still study today. Those sewers flooded into the streets after every heavy rain. Rome fed a population of 1 million people through street-side food stalls with no inspections, no refrigeration, and no way of knowing what had been sitting in those ceramic jars since the day before. And through all of it, 500 years. This is Rome, the greatest and the most dangerous, the peak of human civilization and a system quietly eating itself from the inside. People knew this, or suspected it, or simply lived too close to it to see it clearly. But they stayed, because to be outside Rome was to be outside the world entirely. Tonight, you wake up there, 3rd floor, rented room, stone and brick, one of tens of thousands of identical rooms stacked into the towers that housed most of this city. The sound from the street has already woken you because no one slept in Rome. Daytime traffic was banned, streets too narrow, crowds too thick, which meant every cart, every heavy wagon, every delivery in a city of 1 million people happened at night. A Roman poet writing in the 2nd century put it plainly. To sleep in this city, you need to be either very rich or completely deaf. You go downstairs. There is a food stall on the corner, ceramic pots sunk into a stone counter, hot food, no way of knowing exactly what it is. You order. You eat. There is roughly a 1 in 3 chance you will spend the rest of the day violently ill. You drink the water. It has traveled miles through aqueducts that still stand today, an engineering miracle that fed the largest city in the ancient world. The pipes that carried it were made of lead. You do not know this. No one knows this. Or if they do, there is no other water, so the question goes unasked. You walk toward the Forum. The columns catch the morning light, white marble burning gold. Aqueducts stretch across the sky above the city, vast and impossible, hanging in the morning mist like the bones of something ancient and enormous. And standing there in the noise and the crowd and the heat of the most powerful city in the history of the world, you understand why it lasted. Because this greatness is real. Because these roads and laws and buildings and ideas changed the world and kept changing it long after the last emperor fell. But living inside it was something else entirely. How did they survive? You cannot move past that question, because they did survive, 1 million people, for centuries, inside these same streets, under these same conditions. And while surviving, they wrote poetry, and carved marble, and built laws, and sent armies to the edges of the known world, and changed the shape of everything that came after them. The gap between that achievement and these conditions, between the glory and the danger living side by side in every street and every cup of water and every night of broken sleep, is the sharpest paradox in all of history. Tonight, I am taking you inside it, from that rented room to the Colosseum, from the street food stall to the corridors of the Senate, from the noise of the afternoon crowd to the night, when the wagons start and the darkness comes, and the city becomes something stranger and more dangerous still. One day, but that one day will show you everything. Settle in. Close your eyes. Rome has already begun. The building you slept in last night has no name. Most buildings in Rome have no name. They are simply there, pressed between other buildings exactly like them, rising 5 or 6 floors above streets so narrow that 2 carts cannot pass each other without one stopping entirely. And they are older than anyone on this block remembers, and newer than they should be, because the Insulae of Rome collapse and burn and get rebuilt so frequently that the memory of any individual building rarely outlasts the people who lived in it. Yours is in the Subura. You did not choose the Subura. Nobody chooses the Subura if they have money. It is the dense, low-lying tangle of alleys and slopes that fills the valley between the Esquiline and Viminal hills, the loudest and most crowded quarter of the loudest and most crowded city in the world, and it smells exactly the way you would expect a neighborhood of several 100,000 people with no garbage collection and very little shame to smell. But rent in the Subura is what you can afford, and so the Subura is where you are, and where most of Rome is too, pressed into these stacked stone buildings, 6 people to a floor and a lifetime to a room. The building is 6 stories tall. You are on the 3rd floor, which is neither the most comfortable nor the most dangerous place to be. The ground floor has shops, tabernae, narrow storefronts pressed into the building's face like cells in a hive, open to the street from before dawn, selling bread and olives and heated wine and tools and cloth and the 100 other things a dense neighborhood of working people needs to stay alive through another day. The floor above the shops is the primo sinaculo, the best apartment in the building, highest ceilings, closest to the ground if something goes wrong, and a rent that reflects the privilege of both. Your floor is cheaper. The 4th and 5th and 6th floors are cheaper still, and the people who live up there know exactly why, because everyone in Rome knows. The higher you are, the farther you fall when the fire starts, and in Rome, the fire always starts. This is not an abstraction. The city burned so frequently and so catastrophically that the Emperor Augustus created the vigils, 7 cohorts of freed slaves whose entire purpose was to patrol the streets at night watching for fire. And even so, Insulae on the upper Subura slopes catch every few months, and when one goes, the next one follows, because the buildings are packed so closely, and the upper floors are so often made of wood rather than brick, because wood costs less to build with, and the landlord lives somewhere else entirely, and is not planning to be here when the roof comes down. You are aware of this. You were aware of it when you signed the rental agreement. You are aware of it lying in your room at 3 a.m, listening to the wagons and thinking about the lamp you forgot to fully extinguish. There is no kitchen in your room. There is no kitchen anywhere in this building. This is not an oversight or a poverty. It is a rule, enforced because cooking fires on the upper floors of a 6-story timber-framed insula in a city that burns every few months are not a calculated risk, but a guarantee. And Rome learned this lesson the expensive way so many times that it eventually stopped pretending the lesson needed relearning. You do not cook here. Nobody on your floor cooks here. The woman at the end of the corridor has a small brazier she uses to heat water in the mornings, quietly, hoping the landlord does not find out, and everyone on the floor knows about it, and nobody says anything because everybody understands the cold. Water comes up by bucket. The aqueducts feed the fountains and the public baths, and the grand private houses of people whose names you will never know. But they do not send pipes above the ground floor of any insula, which means that every drop of water used on floors 2 through 6 arrives via the backs of the water sellers, the aguatores, who climb these stairs with their yokes and their vessels all morning long, and charge by the pail, and are the most reliably present human beings in your daily life. You bought 2 buckets yesterday. You have been very careful with them. The morning starts with the chamber pot. This is not a detail the history books dwell on, but it is the first decision of every Roman morning for the vast majority of people who live in buildings like this one. What to do with it. There is a public latrine 3 streets away, which you will use for serious business, but for the pot, it is faster and colder and more honest to simply go to the window, shout the customary warning, "Cave aquam, watch out for the water," and empty it into the street below, where it joins everything else that has been emptied into the street this morning, which is a great deal. The law technically requires you to be more careful than this. The law also does not send anyone to check. You get dressed in the half-dark, tunic, belt, the sandals whose left strap you have been meaning to fix for 2 weeks. There is a quality of morning light in Rome that comes in through the small shuttered window before the shutters are opened, a gray-gold pressure of day against wood, and it has been the same quality of light every morning in this room. And there is something in it that is almost beautiful before the full weight of the day arrives. The staircase is narrow, and the building groans when you step on the 3rd riser from the top, the way it always groans, the way it has been groaning since before you moved in. Somebody has left a sandal on the 2nd floor landing. The door to the front apartment on the 2nd floor is already open, and voices are coming through it. 2 men speaking quickly, the particular cadence of a financial argument between people who are also friends, which is to say, an argument with no clean ending. The ground floor taberna is already operating, the baker's boy restacking round loaves on the counter, while a woman in a pale blue mantle examines them with the professional skepticism of someone who has been buying bread in this neighborhood for 20 years and knows every trick. The street receives you. The first thing you notice is the sound, not the loudness of it, which you have adjusted to, but the layering of it, the way 100 different sounds from 100 different sources stack on top of each other until the alley holds more noise than its physical dimensions should permit. Voices, footsteps, the slap of wet cloth, something being hammered 2 buildings down, a child laughing somewhere above you, the low, persistent rumble of the city's basic mechanical life. The second thing you notice is the smell, which has its own layers. Bread from the bakery on the corner, smoke from a dozen different sources, the drainage channel running along the side of the street, carrying whatever it carries, and beneath all of it, that dense background presence of 1 million people living closely together that is simply the smell of Rome. The way cities have a smell that is entirely their own and entirely inseparable from what they are. The morning crowd is already in full movement. This is the hour of the salutatio, which means the streets are thick with clients on their way to pay their respects to whoever has the power to make their lives better. Walking fast with the focused energy of people who understand that being late to your patron's door is not an embarrassment, but a statement, and a statement in this city has consequences that trail you for years. At the corner, the Thermopolium is open and busy. You have learned to love the Thermopolium with the specific love that comes from having no other options. The dolia, deep ceramic vessels sunk into the stone counter, their contents kept warm by the mass of stone around them, hold the morning's food, a thick grain porridge, lentils dressed with garum, something that might be a vegetable stew made from yesterday's vegetables and today's optimism. You point to the porridge, you hand over the coins, you take your bowl to the ledge along the wall where other early risers are standing and eating with their eyes on the street. The food is hot and heavy and filling, which is what matters. The garum poured over it has a sharpness that wakes you more effectively than the light. Around you, people eat quickly, purposefully, already thinking about whatever comes next. You finish eating. You hand back the bowl. You stand in the street for a moment, with the sun now fully clear of the roofline, and the day pressing forward with the particular urgency that a Roman morning always carries, as though the city itself knows that there is too much to do and too little time to do it in, and has communicated this somehow to every one of the 1 million people currently moving through its streets. You keep walking. The day has begun. The Romans ate twice a day, and neither meal was what you would call a meal. The ientaculum, the morning meal, was not cooked, not prepared with any particular care, not shared with anyone who did not happen to be standing near you at the time. It was bread, if bread was available, dipped in olive oil, or spread with a little salt, perhaps a handful of olives or dried figs if the week had been a good one, and eaten quickly and without ceremony, usually standing up, usually while already moving somewhere else. There were no plates. There were no tables in the morning sense. You ate the way the city operated, in motion, without stopping, with the next obligation already visible on the horizon. Rome's primary daily drink is not water. It is wine, but wine consumed in the Roman way, which is diluted with water in ratios of 2 or 3 parts water to 1 part wine. The mixing performed in the crater that sat at the center of any formal meal, and that provided the social lubricant for everything from the morning negotiation to the senator's dinner. Undiluted wine was for barbarians and for men who had decided to stop pretending to be civilized, and the Romans had strong feelings about what it meant to consume wine correctly. The cheapest option, the pasca, a mixture of water and vinegar that soldiers and the working poor carried in leather flasks, is sour enough to make you wince the first time, but it is antiseptic in ways that untreated water is not, which is why it survived on military campaigns where the water supply was uncertain. The wine the stall on your street sells from its large amphorae comes in 3 qualities, and the quality you can afford has an astringency you have learned to think of as character. Falernian wine, the most celebrated in the Roman world, aged in sealed amphorae for decades in the volcanic warmth of Campania's cellars, poured only at tables wealthy enough to signal the luxury of pouring it. You will not drink Falernian wine, and this is simply one of the many lines the city draws without ceremony between the lives of different people. The grain dole, the annona, the great feeding system by which Rome kept a population of 1 million people from starving and from rioting simultaneously, provided a monthly allocation of grain to citizens who registered for it. And the line for that grain was long, and the process was humbling, and most people who collected it were not embarrassed about doing so, because in Rome eating was survival, and survival was not something you were expected to be ashamed of. The annona was not simple to administer. It required a continuous chain of decisions stretching from the grain fields of Egypt and North Africa through the harbor at Ostia, where the grain ships docked to the vast warehouses lining the Tiber where the grain was stored, from there to the Horia Galbana and the other great warehouse complexes where it waited for distribution to the mensores frumentari, the grain measurers who oversaw the handout points. Behind all of it stood the curator Anani, the official whose career depended on no one starving and no one rioting over food, which in a city of 1 million people were not entirely separate concerns. The tessera frumentaria, the wooden token qualifying a citizen for his monthly allocation, was worth something real. It could be sold, borrowed against, passed to a family member. 200,000 eligible recipients at any given time depended on it. The dole did not provide cooked food, it provided raw grain. Turning grain into something edible required water and fire and time and equipment, all of which most people on the upper floors of an insula had only partial access to, which is why the Thermopolia were always full and why the street vendors who sold hot chickpeas and fried dough from portable ceramic stoves were among the most essential figures in the daily life of the city. Garum was in everything. The fermented fish sauce, produced in enormous quantities in factories along the North African and Spanish coasts, shipped to Rome in terracotta amphorae, stacked in the holds of the grain fleet's companion vessels, distributed from the great warehouses along the Tiber to the Thermopolia and the tabernae and the private kitchens of the wealthy, is the dominant flavoring agent of Roman cooking, the salt and the umami, and the depth all in one brown liquid that smells when applied directly to the nose, like something has gone fundamentally and biologically wrong, but which in the food, used correctly and in the right quantity, adds a complexity that explains why every Roman who could afford it used it on everything. Its finest varieties sold for prices comparable to good wine. Pliny the Elder described the best garum as a liquor to be savored like the finest vintages of Campania. On the garum, he was not far wrong. Bread was the foundation of everything. The panis quadratus, the round loaf divided into 8 segments by deep cuts made before baking, recognizable immediately to any Roman and identifiable from carbonized examples found 2,000 years later, still sitting in the ovens of Pompeii, was eaten at every level of Roman society, the quality varying enormously by price and social position. The cheapest bread was dark and dense and required significant effort to chew, sometimes adulterated with sawdust or ground acorns when the harvest had been difficult. The finest bread, white, fine-crumbed, baked from the best wheat flour, signaled wealth as clearly as the toga that accompanied it to dinner. The difference between the two was visible in the mouth and in the social hierarchy simultaneously, because what you ate in Rome communicated where you stood, which was perhaps why the Romans paid such close attention to what everyone around them was eating. The mill occupied the lower floor of most Roman bakeries and its basalt millstones, cone-shaped stones rotating inside an hourglass-shaped upper stone, driven by donkeys walking in circles or by enslaved workers whose job was entirely this: ran through most nights, the grinding noise adding to the city's nocturnal soundtrack the low, continuous percussion of stone on stone. The baker owned his millstones the way a physician owned his instruments, and the quality of the stone mattered, sourced from the volcanic deposits of Campania, where the particular properties of lava rock produced a grinding surface that generated less heat and therefore less chemical change in the flour. 22 bakeries in Pompeii have been excavated with millstones intact. Rome, a city 50 times Pompeii's size, had proportionally more, and their collective overnight output is what stood between order and chaos in the most powerful city in the world. The Thermopolium on your corner is not the only food option on your street. Rome sustains its million people through a distributed network of food provision so dense that on most streets in the Subura there is a source of prepared food within 20 meters in any direction. The sausage sellers carry their portable grills through the streets in the late morning, the smoke and fat smell of Lucanicae, spiced pork sausages from the Lucanian tradition that had become generic across the city, preceding them through the alleys. The sesame cake vendors work from trays hung around their necks. The chestnut roasters occupy corners when chestnuts are in season and disappear when they are not. The wine stalls, Capone with their narrow counters and their amphorae, and their reputation as the last resort of people who have run out of better options, provide both wine and simple food throughout the day and into the night. Their lights among the last to go out, and their customers among the last to leave. What you cannot find within walking distance in any direction in this city, you probably do not need. The cena, the main meal of the day eaten in the evening, was the meal that distinguished the comfortable from the poor more sharply than anything else. In a wealthy household, the cena structured an evening of 3 hours or more. 3 courses served to guests reclining on the triclinium couches, the gustazio of eggs and olives and small bites to open the appetite, the prima mensa of roasted meats and fish and the elaborate sauces that demonstrated the cook's range, the secunda mensa of fruits and sweet cakes and preserved figs, the honeyed things that the Romans called dessert and consumed while the wine moved in its final circuit. The host's position on the central couch was visible to every guest. The slave attending the mixing bowl monitored cups before they were asked. The conversation was the real point, the negotiation and disclosure and relationship maintenance that the formal contexts of the morning did not permit. For those without the space or the household to produce this, the cena was whatever the Thermopolium still had available at the end of the afternoon, eaten standing at the counter, which is the meal you will have tonight, and it will fill you, and you will not die from it. And this is the standard you have stopped apologizing for. You eat what you have. You take what the stall provides. You develop an understanding of which vendors produce food that is safe to eat on which days of the week, based on the accumulated knowledge of a neighborhood that has been eating at these stalls for generations. A man selling hot chickpeas from a portable stove at the corner of the next street. You buy a portion wrapped in a scrap of cloth. You eat them walking. You are full, approximately. The day continues. The water that comes out of the fountain at the end of your street has traveled 42 miles. It started in the Alban Hills, in a spring whose water the Romans recognized as among the finest available near the city. Cold and clear and tasting of the limestone the water had moved through slowly underground, filtered by centuries of passage through rock that removed almost everything biological from it. From that spring, the water was captured in a settling tank and then directed into the spicus, the covered stone channel of the aqueduct, which ran above ground on arches wherever the terrain dropped below the required gradient, and through tunnels wherever the terrain rose, maintaining an almost imperceptible downward slope across 42 miles of hills and valleys and the crossings of 2 rivers, losing elevation at roughly 1 foot per mile, arriving in the city with enough pressure to feed the Castellum Divisorium at the top of the distribution network, from which it was divided into pipes and sent toward the baths and the fountains and the private connections of whoever could pay for them. This is the Aqua Virgo, one of 11 major aqueducts serving Rome by the 2nd century, not the oldest and not the largest, but consistently reliable, its water quality consistently praised, and it runs today. Its source still flowing, its path through the city still operational in modified form, still feeding water through the heart of Rome 2,000 years after the engineers who built it are dust. The engineering required to produce these structures was extraordinary, not in its theoretical sophistication, but in its practical precision. The Romans understood hydraulics the way craftsmen understand their materials, empirically through generations of building things and watching what happened and correcting what went wrong. They understood that water moving too slowly would deposit sediment and eventually block the channel. They understood that water moving too fast would erode the channel's mortar. They understood that a covered channel with a constant gradient and a consistent cross-section would self-clean to a remarkable degree, carrying suspended particles all the way to the settling tanks at the distribution end. And they understood that the height of the water at the source determined the pressure at every point downstream, which is why the aqueduct arches rise so high over the Roman Campagna. Not for aesthetic effect, but to maintain the elevation that translates into the pressure that makes the whole system function. By the 1st century AD, Rome was receiving approximately 300 million gallons of water per day. This is an almost incomprehensible figure, more water per person per day than most modern cities provide, and it was provided continuously without pumps, powered entirely by the Earth's gravity and the patience of the engineers who selected sources at the right elevation and built channels at the right gradient. Sextus Julius Frontinus, appointed Curator Aquarum, the official overseer of Rome's water, in 97 AD, spent his first years in the post conducting a systematic survey of every pipe and fountain and private connection in the city. And the record he produced reveals not only the system's extraordinary scale, but the extraordinary scale of the theft operating within it. Illegal taps were everywhere. Dishonest water workers diverted flow to private customers for personal payment. The official record of pipe diameters at the delivery end did not match the official record of pipe diameters at the intake end, and the difference, the aqua caduca, the water that disappeared between source and destination, was water stolen by the people responsible for keeping it flowing. Frontinus documented this with the resigned precision of a man who understood that any sufficiently large infrastructure system produces equally large corruption, and that the first step to addressing either is knowing how bad it actually is. The distribution hierarchy was fixed by imperial decree and could not be negotiated. Public works, the baths, the public fountains, the Circus Maximus, the Colosseum's cooling systems, received water first and continuously, their supply guaranteed regardless of season or available flow. Private connections came second, fed from whatever the public works left, and during periods of low flow, summer droughts when the source springs ran lower, years when the channel mortar cracked and needed repair, private supply was the first to be reduced or cut entirely. If you were a private household with a paid connection, you were paying for reliability that was not always delivered, and you knew this when you paid, and you paid anyway because the alternative was depending entirely on public fountains and water cellars. And your wealth was at least partly a matter of not having to depend on the same things as everyone else. To obtain a private water connection, you petitioned the curator aquarum, paid the connection fee, paid the annual maintenance charge calculated by the diameter of the pipe connecting to the distribution network, and received in return the right to draw a specified volume from the mains. The pipe installed was measured in quinaria, units of pipe diameter, and the charge scaled accordingly. A wealthy household with a large diameter pipe for baths and gardens paid considerably more than a modest household drawing enough for cooking and drinking. The pipes themselves were lead, supplied and installed by the Officina Plumbaria, the official waterworkers guild whose members also maintained the network and were in a position to know exactly where the illegal taps were and whose pockets contained exactly what it cost to ignore them. The seasonal behavior of the aqueduct system was one of the persistent challenges that Frontinus documented with the patient frustration of an administrator who has found a problem he cannot fully solve. The springs that fed the aqueducts were subject to the same seasonal variation as any natural source, running fuller in the wet months when the hills above Rome were saturated, and lower in the dry summer months when the Alban hills baked and the springs reduced their flow by fractions that were individually small and collectively significant. The great storage cisterns that the Romans built at various points in the distribution network cushioned these variations without eliminating them. And in a dry summer, the distribution hierarchy became visible in its real-world consequences. The public fountains running lower than usual, the upper floors of the more distant neighborhoods receiving their water later in the day, the private connections of the less wealthy cutting to a trickle, while the baths and the fountains of the imperial district maintained full flow because the imperial district's connections were closer to the mains and higher in the distribution priority than everything else. The city's water was never absent. The aqueducts never ran dry entirely, but it was not always equally distributed, and the patterns of that unequal distribution followed the patterns of Roman inequality in ways that would not have surprised anyone who thought about it. Patterns that are too familiar to be remarkable are the most durable kind. What they did not understand was what the pipes were doing to the water. The Insulae Plumbea, the lead pipes that distributed water within the city, were made of lead because lead made sense. It was abundant in the mines of Spain and Britain and Sardinia. It was cheaper than bronze and far more workable, bendable around corners, joinable with techniques that any trained worker could learn. It did not rust the way iron did, and it had been in use for long enough that nobody was alive who remembered a time before it, which meant nobody had a before and after comparison from which to draw conclusions about what the pipes were doing to the water passing through them, and from there to the bodies consuming it. Lead dissolves into water. The rate depends on the chemistry of the water, the temperature, and the age of the pipe. And Roman water from limestone springs was hard water with a relatively low dissolving capacity for lead, which means the pipes were doing less damage than they could have been doing, which does not mean they were doing no damage. The skeletal remains of Romans from lead isotope analysis show elevated lead concentrations compared to pre-Roman populations in the same geographic areas. Vitruvius, the first-century architect, wrote explicitly that water from lead pipes was not as healthful as water from clay pipes, and that workers in lead foundries showed observable physical deterioration. He recommended clay pipes where possible. The recommendation was not widely followed because clay pipes were more expensive and more fragile, and the Romans were very good at weighing practical costs against theoretical benefits and concluding that the theoretical benefit was not worth the practical cost, which is how a civilization that knew lead was not ideal for water pipes ended up supplying its entire capital city through a network of lead pipes for 5 centuries. You stand at the fountain and fill your jug and drink, and the water is cold and good. And you drink as much as you need, because the day is already warm, and you will need to carry the jug with you, or refill it at the next fountain, which is no more than 2 or 3 streets away in any direction. Rome has fountains everywhere, the overflow from the aqueducts, maintaining a continuous flow at hundreds of public points throughout the city. And the accessibility of cold, continuously flowing water is one of the genuine achievements of Roman urban life, one of the things that made the city livable in a way that other cities of the ancient world were not. The Tiber moves brownly past the docks at the bottom of the valley. People fish in it. Some people drink from it, the people at the very bottom of the economic hierarchy who cannot get to a fountain or cannot afford the water cellars. The river receives the cloaca and its tributaries and everything that the city produces and disposes of, and it carries all of it toward the sea without complaint, and has been carrying it for 7 centuries before you arrived, and will carry it for several centuries after you leave. The city drinks. The city does not fully understand what it is drinking. The city continues. The man who holds your future in his hands lives 12 blocks from the Insula, in a house whose blank exterior wall gives no indication of the world behind it. His name is Marcus Aemilius Rufus. He is not famous. He will appear in no history. He is a moderately prosperous grain merchant with connections in the Aventine warehouses that matter to people who control other things that matter. And he has been patron to 14 clients for a decade, and you have been the most recent addition for 3 months, brought in through a chain of introductions so thin that you can trace it from memory. A freedman who knew a freedman who had done accounts for someone in Rufus's extended household, and the connection is tenuous. But in Rome, all connections begin somewhere and grow, or don't, from whatever seed they start with. The Patronus Cliens system is as old as Rome itself. Its origins disappear into the period before the Republic, before the law, before the city took its current shape, rooted in the fundamental human arrangement, by which those who have resources and those who need resources create a structured relationship that benefits both parties in ways neither could achieve without the other. The patron offers protection and legal assistance, and the sportula, the food basket or its cash equivalent distributed to clients at the morning salutatio, and the use of his connections and influence in whatever spheres his influence extends. The client offers presence, political support in whatever context political support matters, labor when labor is needed, and the simple social amplification that comes from being publicly seen to have people who depend on you and who show up every morning to demonstrate their dependence. The patron's status is partly measured by the number and quality of his morning callers. The client's survival margin is partly supplied by the sportula and the goodwill of a man positioned above him in the hierarchy. The house announces Rufus is standing before you step inside. From the street there is nothing. A blank plastered wall, a heavy wooden door, the iron ring you pull to summon the ostiarius. But the ostiarius who answers is himself a measure of the household. Not a hired boy, but a trained enslaved man whose position at the threshold is a semi-permanent assignment, whose face you recognize from every previous visit, whose knowledge of who you are and what tier you occupy in the household's social mathematics determines the warmth of his greeting and the speed of your admission. This morning he opens the door without hesitation and nods you through into the fosses, the narrow entrance corridor, and from there into the atrium. The atrium tells you everything. The impluvium pool at the center, modest but properly proportioned, catching the gray morning light through the compluvium opening above. The lararium in its niche on the wall. Fresh flowers on the ledge below the painted household gods, evidence that a household took its religious obligations seriously rather than treating them as decoration. The imagines maiorum in their wooden cabinets, the wax masks of Rufus's ancestors, real and claimed, displayed in the careful arrangement that communicated family history across generations in a city that valued the depth of a family's roots as a form of social currency. The floor is not marble. That would announce a different level of wealth entirely, but smooth flagstone laid in a pattern that required skill and care, which is its own kind of announcement. Neither party is under any illusion about what is being exchanged at the salutatio. This is not charity, and it is not friendship, though it can develop into something resembling both, and it is not quite employment, though it has employment's quality of regular obligation. It is a contractual relationship of mutual benefit articulated through the language of personal loyalty, and it is the invisible skeleton upon which the visible body of Roman social life is built. Rufus himself has a patron, a man of equestrian rank with connections to the grain supply administration, a man whose name Rufus mentions occasionally to signal the level above him on the same ladder you are both climbing. And that patron has a patron whose name connects eventually to the senatorial families whose reach extends into the structures of imperial governance. Every Roman of any standing is simultaneously a client looking upward and a patron looking downward, bound in both directions by the same web of obligation and expectation, and the web extends across the entire city. You arrive at the door as the salutatio is already in progress. 6 men ahead view in the atrium. You recognize 2 of them from previous mornings and nod. The hierarchy of waiting is readable in the togas, in the posture, in the way the doorkeeper greeted each arrival. You are near the bottom of this morning's social gradient, which is a position you have occupied often enough to have stopped being surprised by it, and not quite often enough to have stopped feeling it. The man at the top of the gradient is a building contractor whose connection to Rufus is more financially significant than yours, and who is therefore admitted first and emerges from the tablinum faster, having conducted a business discussion rather than a social ritual, the distinction between the two being one of the things that money clarifies. When your turn comes, you step into the tablinum. Rufus looks up. He uses your name. This is one of the things he does that costs him nothing and means something to all 14 of his clients. He has memorized the names and the basic situation of each of them, and he references that situation in the brief exchange of the salutatio in a way that demonstrates retention. Being remembered by someone above you in the hierarchy is a small but genuine comfort in a city where being forgotten is a constant risk. He asks a question, receives an answer, nods, and dismisses you with the sportula. A few coins today, enough for 3 days at the Thermopolium if you are careful, which you will be. Your obligations to him in return are not vague. You appear at the morning salutatio. You attend his public appearances, adding your presence to the crowd that demonstrates his standing. If he stands for a civic position, you demonstrate support. If he needs a witness for a legal transaction, you provide your name. If he invites you to dinner, which happens for the more valued clients 3 or 4 times a year, you attend, you are personable, you are present but not intrusive, and you remember everything said and by whom, because the information that circulates at a patron's dinner table is some of the most valuable information in the city. You are also expected to refer him to anyone in your own small network who might be useful to him, which is how networks grow in Rome. Slowly, one introduction at a time. In the atrium on the way out, you pause beside a freedman named Titus Claudianus, a man who was enslaved as a child in a household in Capua, trained as an account keeper, eventually manumitted, and is now running a small textile import business with enough success to have become a client of Rufus's, not out of need, but out of the strategic recognition that Rufus's network of contacts is useful to his commercial interests. He carries himself differently from the other men in the atrium. There is a quality of self-possession that comes from having understood the system from the outside before gaining access to it from the inside, and he watches the room with the attentiveness of someone who trusts nothing that has not been verified. What Titus Claudianus has, that you do not yet have, is a mental map of Rome's invisible networks, the systems of relationship and obligation and debt and favor that run beneath the visible social surface in the same way the aqueducts run beneath the visible city. Invisible unless you know to look for them, and determinative of everything despite their invisibility. He knows which of Rufus's other clients have connections into the Aventine grain warehouses, and which are there purely for the coins. He knows which freedmen in this neighborhood have accumulated enough capital and enough commercial relationships to be worth cultivating as future business contacts. He knows which of the senators whose names appear on public dedications are actually well positioned within the current emperor's favor, and which are maintaining the appearances of influence while the substance leaches away, because the difference between those two categories is the difference between a patron worth pursuing and a patron whose protection is expiring like a lease that will not be renewed. This knowledge is not written anywhere. It is not taught in any school. It is accumulated through the specific kind of attention that survival as an outsider working your way inward teaches. The observation of a man who spent the first portion of his life with very little margin for error and developed in consequence a precision of perception that people with more margin tend not to need. He nods at you on the way out of the atrium, and you nod back, and neither of you says anything, and the silence is not unfriendly, but it is the silence of two people conducting different calculations who have not yet reached the point where pooling them would benefit either one. Social mobility in Rome is real. It is also slow, and the distance it allows is not infinite, and the proportion of people who actually move significantly within their lifetime is smaller than the stories Rome tells about itself. Freedmen become wealthy. Some become very wealthy, accumulating fortunes that dwarf those of families whose freeborn status stretches back for generations. The children of freedmen are full citizens with no legal asterisk on their status, and the grandchildren of freedmen can stand for political office, which means that within 2 generations a family can move from enslavement to the formal structures of civic participation. This is not nothing. By the standards of the ancient world, it is remarkable. By the standards of the aspirations it creates in the people who hear about it, it is always slightly less than what was promised. You walk home through the morning city. The day has given you your coins and your obligations and your place in the structure, and all 3 will need to be renewed tomorrow. Getting lost in Rome is not a failure of navigation. It is an architectural inevitability. The city was not planned. There is no grid, no overarching urban vision that preceded the buildings and organized their placement. Rome grew the way organisms grow, outward from its original centers on the Palatine and Capitoline, down into the valleys, up the remaining hills, across the floodplain near the river, filling every available space with the logic of whoever needed to build something next and could afford the ground to build it on. Streets followed the paths that people walked before the streets were paved. Buildings filled the gaps between other buildings. The Forum Romanum, the civic heart of the empire, is surrounded by structures built in different centuries by different patrons for different purposes, and the accumulated result is not chaotic exactly, but it is not organized in any way that helps a newcomer find their destination without a guide. There are no street signs. There are no addresses in the modern sense. Letters sent within Rome were addressed by landmark and proximity. Near the 2nd column of the Temple of Saturn, 3 doors past the fullers on the Subura Major, below the bakery with the red awning. And their successful delivery depended entirely on the carrier's knowledge of the neighborhood and the willingness of bystanders to point out where things were. Navigating Rome is a skill acquired slowly, one neighborhood at a time, until the city's spatial logic becomes legible the way a language becomes legible, not from learning rules, but from immersion long enough that the patterns resolve themselves. The streets themselves are a continuous negotiation between competing uses. The major roads, the viae, are wide enough for 2 loaded carts to pass if the drivers are cooperative and the loads are not too wide, and they are flanked by raised stone sidewalks of varying height above the road surface, and they are crossed at intervals by stepping stones set into the road at a height that keeps a pedestrian's feet above the standing water and runoff that accumulates after rain. The stepping stones are positioned to allow cartwheels to pass between them in the gaps, which is a piece of urban engineering so practical and so simple that you notice it the 3rd or 4th time you use it and wonder why you did not notice it immediately. The Subura's side streets are narrow enough that stretching your arms would nearly touch both walls in some of them. And in these, the pedestrian always yields to the cart, and the cart always yields to nothing. Not everyone moves through these streets the same way. The very wealthy move in electrici, covered litters carried on the shoulders of specially trained slaves, typically 4 or more for a person of serious standing, with additional slaves walking ahead to clear the path and behind to manage the social consequences of the passage. The litter means you do not touch the road, do not breathe the street directly, do not navigate. You are carried through the city as though the city were a landscape to be viewed rather than a space to be moved through, which is not entirely wrong. Below the litter owners, those who can afford 1 or 2 torch-bearers at night consider themselves comfortable. Below them you walk, which is what almost everyone does, and the walking is both the great democratizing experience of Rome, senators and freedmen negotiating the same narrow streets, stepping aside for the same carts, and the constant physical reminder of where everyone stands. The street's sensory texture is its own kind of orientation system. The fuller's shops, the fullones who clean and treat cloth by treading it in vats of human urine collected from the public urns outside every insula, which the fullers were permitted by law to use, and which nobody in the neighborhood found particularly strange because it had always been this way. Announce themselves before you see them. The ammonia smells sharp and specific enough that you know before you turn the corner whether there is a fuller on the block. The smiths announce themselves with sound, the metallic percussion audible from 3 streets away. The garlic sellers' stalls fill their section of the market with an enthusiasm that leaves no ambiguity about their product. The city speaks through these specific signatures, and after long enough in the same neighborhood, you navigate partly by them. The smell of the fullers and the sound of the smith's hammer locating you in the grid of known things as precisely as any sign would. The street vendors of Rome occupied the space between private shops and the absence of anything at all, filling the gaps in the commercial infrastructure with a flexibility that fixed establishments could not match. The hot food sellers you already know, but the range of what moves through the streets on portable equipment or in baskets carried on heads and shoulders is wider than any fixed market offers. The crier of onions with his strings of them hung around his neck like jewelry. The seller of sulfur matches who announces himself by the smell that precedes him. The vendor of iron goods who rings his bell while walking. The bird seller with his cages stacked in a tower of bamboo. The astrologer who sets up his small table at a promising corner and reads charts for people who have questions. The official augurs are too expensive and too distant to answer. Each of these trades has its particular voice, its particular sound or smell that announces it around corners and through walls before it arrives in your line of sight. And the city communicates in these voices the way it communicates in everything else. Specifically, insistently, through 100 different channels simultaneously, so that navigating Rome is also reading Rome, decoding its street-level messages for information about what is available and where and what it costs, until the city speaks to you in a language you did not know you were learning and cannot now stop hearing. The road surface is volcanic basalt, dark and hard and worn smooth by generations of feet and hooves and wheels. And it holds heat through the day and releases it through the evening and the early night, so that stepping onto a major street in Rome in the hours after dark is stepping onto something that is still warm from the sun's attention, radiating a memory of daytime upward through your sandals. In summer, this is uncomfortable. In the cool months, it is one of the small pleasures of living in a city built from materials that store warmth. When you need to find a specific place in Rome for the first time, you ask. This is the method that everyone uses and that works reasonably well in a city whose inhabitants have been providing directions to strangers for 7 centuries and have developed efficient ways of communicating location through the language of proximity to landmarks that everyone knows. The Temple of Saturn is at the foot of the Capitoline. Everyone knows the Temple of Saturn. 3 streets north of the Temple of Saturn, left at the fuller's shop, past the bakery whose awning was red until last season and is now a dark green, but whose smell still identifies it clearly enough through the passage between the warehouses. And there you are. The landmarks are reliable in a way the streets themselves are not, because the streets shift between visits and have no names worth asking about, but the temples have been standing for generations and will stand for generations more, and the smell of the fullers is the smell of the fullers wherever you encounter it, and the baker's bread announces itself from 20 meters, regardless of what color the awning is. Rome navigates itself through the accumulated knowledge of everyone in it, and you are slowly becoming part of that knowledge, one route at a time. The daytime city is physically demanding, carrying anything, a jug of water, a bag of goods, your own weight through the crowd on the Via Sacra during the morning peak, requires sustained effort. And the Romans who live here and work here are, as a general physical type, considerably stronger and more durable than their apparent social status might suggest, because the city asks this of everyone, regardless of rank. Senators walk, equestrians walk. The whole city is on foot from dawn to dusk, and the 7 hills it occupies are not a metaphor, but a genuine topographic challenge that the Romans have paved over and stepped on and built upon, without ever quite flattening. The night city is a different problem entirely. When the traffic ban lifts at dusk, the streets transform. The pedestrian-dominated daytime roads become the domain of the wagons, their drivers making up for the hours of enforced stillness, moving at a pace that the daytime city's crowds would never permit, and that the nighttime darkness makes genuinely hazardous for anyone on foot who is not paying careful attention. The drivers shout, the traditional Roman cart driver's combination of command and insult and warning that other drivers recognize and respond to, and that pedestrians hear as simply noise. And the wheels strike the stone with a continuous percussion that carries through the walls of every building on every street. There is no street lighting. What lighting exists is provided by individuals, wealthy households with slave torch carriers, taverns and all-night food stalls with lamps in their doorways, the occasional private citizen who has paid for a torch. Between these points of light there is genuine darkness, the darkness of a city before gas or electricity. And in this darkness, the second economy of Rome operates with the efficiency of any enterprise that has learned to function in the space where official attention does not reach. The vigils, 7 cohorts, roughly 7,000 men, are primarily fire watchers. They walk at night looking for the glow of a fire and carry the equipment to fight it. And they are reasonably effective at this work. Criminal deterrence is a secondary function, performed with less organization and less success. And the consequence is that the nighttime city below the economic threshold of a torch carrier is genuinely dangerous in ways the daytime city is not. You are inside before the second hour of the night. Rome is outside, still moving, still conducting its business in the dark. You are inside. This is the correct division. The baths open at noon. Not for reasons of hygiene in the modern sense. The Romans do not think about bathing the way you think about it, as a private necessity performed in isolation for personal cleanliness. They think about it the way they think about the forum or the evening scena, as a social occasion that happens to involve water, a place where the city conducts its secondary business in an environment that the heat and the steam and the particular candor that shared nakedness produces makes more revealing than most formal settings. The baths are where you encounter people you cannot reach through the formal structures of patronage and commercial life. They are where information circulates. They are where the city thinks out loud, in the steam. Most serious bathers arrive before the bathing begins. The palaestra, the exercise ground that every substantial bathhouse includes, an open courtyard of sand or packed earth surrounded by colonnades, fills in the late morning with men running circuits, lifting stone weights, playing the various ball games that Rome has absorbed and adapted from Greek tradition. The game of harpastum, a fierce competitive ball sport involving a small hard ball that opposing teams attempt to control, produces the concentrated effort and the bruises of something genuinely competitive. Wrestling pairs occupy corners. The serious athletes, the men who consider their physical condition a matter of professional importance, work with the focus of anyone doing skilled work in public. You have never been particularly athletic, but you run several circuits of the palaestra because you have learned that the bathing sequence works better when the body arrives at it, already warm and open. And because the run produces a loosening in the back and the shoulders that the weight of the morning's obligations has been steadily tightening. After exercise, oil. The anointing with olive oil before bathing is not optional and not symbolic. It is functional, the oil doing the work of cleaning that soap would do in a later world, loosening the day's accumulation from the skin so the strigil can carry it away. You apply what you carry yourself, the bronze flask hanging from your belt alongside the strigil, and the ritual of application is one of the more sensory experiences the Roman day provides. The smell of the oil, the temperature of the palaestra in the afternoon sun, the particular quality of attention that preparing your own body for something requires. Those with the money or the household to bring a slave to the baths have someone else apply the oil to the unreachable parts of the back, Everyone else asks a companion or develops a gymnastic flexibility that the daily practice eventually provides. The Baths of Agrippa, built by Marcus Agrippa in the last years of the previous century and given to the people of Rome as a free public facility, entry cost nothing, the maintenance funded by income from the properties Agrippa endowed for the purpose, occupy a substantial section of the Campus Martius and receive on a busy afternoon several thousand visitors. They are not the largest baths in Rome. The baths of Nero, opened a generation later, are larger, and the baths of Caracalla and Diocletian that will be built in the centuries ahead will dwarf both of these in scale and sophistication. But Agrippa's baths are maintained and functional, and the water that flows through them is cold and clean in the sense that cold running water from the aqueducts is always relatively clean at the point of delivery. The apoditerium, the changing room, is half full when you arrive. You undress and hang your clothes on the wooden peg. A second pair of eyes on your clothes costs you a small coin. An attendant sits near the pegs offering to watch the belongings of those who can pay, which is the closest thing the baths provide to security. And the city's bath thieves have learned to work quickly in the moment when an unattended visitor is between the changing room and the pools. You pay the attendant. You stand for a moment in the way everyone stands in the apoditerium, experiencing the leveling effect of the baths, where the toga of a senator and the tunic of a freedman both reduced to the same fundamental condition, and the hierarchy must reconstruct itself from other indicators. The quality of your oil flask, whether you have a slave at your heel, the people who greet you by name. The sequence moves inward and then hotter. The cold pool of the frigidarium first, a plunge that shocks the body into a different alertness, that closes the pores and makes the subsequent heat more meaningful. The tepidarium next, its warmth maintained by the hypocaust system, the network of hollow channels beneath the floor through which hot air from the furnaces circulates continuously, warming the tile above and the room above that, at an efficiency that the Romans discovered empirically and refined over generations. Then the caldarium, where the heat is significant and the steam is dense and the conversation is loudest, because the caldarium's heat loosens people in ways that the other rooms do not, and the loosened conversation produces things that people would not say in a formal context. There are vendors in the baths. They walk the colonnaded passages between the rooms with trays of sausages and cups of warm wine and small cakes, their calls competing with the sound of several thousand simultaneous conversations. And their presence here is not surprising. Wherever large numbers of Romans gather for any length of time, a commercial infrastructure forms around them, because the Romans understood that captive audiences are the best customers. You buy a cup of hot wine with honey. The vendor moves on. The heat of the caldarium and the heat of the wine and the loosening of the muscles after the palaestra produce together a specific quality of Roman afternoon contentment that is not happiness exactly, but is its close functional neighbor. The strigil replaces soap. Oil applied to the skin and scraped off with the curved metal blade, the oil carrying with it the day's accumulation of street and sweat. The process requires either a slave to apply the oil to your back or the flexibility to reach everything yourself. And the baths provide attendants for hire for those who have neither slave nor flexibility. and the attendants do their work with the professional neutrality of people who have scraped the backs of several thousand clients without developing strong feelings about any of them. The social use of the baths was not limited to the bathing rooms themselves. Most substantial facilities included a library, a room with scroll niches cut into the walls, open to anyone who had paid admission, stocked with a selection of texts that the facility's patron had donated or the management had acquired, and frequented by people who came to read rather than to bathe, or who combined both, settling into a corner after the caldarium with a borrowed scroll while the steam in the adjacent rooms rose and fell. The practice of reading aloud to oneself, standard in the ancient world, meant that the library was not quiet in any modern sense. It was a room full of people muttering texts at approximately conversational volume, each in their own world and simultaneously in everyone else's. Public recitations sometimes took place in the palaestra area, where a reader could command the audience of several hundred people who happened to be present and could not easily leave, which was an early version of the captive audience that entrepreneurs have sought in every era. The baths were not merely where the body was cleaned. They were where the mind was fed, where social bonds were maintained, where the city conducted its horizontal business, the commerce between near equals, in a medium of heat and water that made people candid in ways other environments did not. The neighborhood balnea, the small commercial bathhouses that operated throughout the city's residential quarters, including several within 10 minutes' walk of your insula, were the option available to people who could not make the journey to the major facilities. They charged an as or two for entry, ran smaller and hotter and louder than the great baths, and provided the same basic sequence at reduced scale and reduced elegance. The water was less reliable, dependent on a smaller aqueduct connection, and the crowd was the neighborhood crowd, rather than the city-wide mix that the great baths assembled, which meant less social range but more familiarity, the particular quality of a space where you kept encountering people you already knew, and where the conversation picked up from where it had left off the previous visit. Some of the city's residents used the large baths once a week, and the neighborhood balnea daily, the same way they used the major Thermopolium occasionally and the corner food stall every morning, the smaller local option serving the needs of the day, and the larger institution serving the needs of the occasion. The city provided both, and its population had long since sorted itself among them according to time and money and need. Here is what you do not fully register when you first begin using the baths. They make you sick. Not immediately and not dramatically and not every time, but the communal water of the large pools, receiving the bodies of several thousand visitors each day, visitors who carry the ordinary parasitic and bacterial load of people living in first-century Rome, is a vector for transmission of the eye infections and skin conditions and gastrointestinal illnesses that Rome's medical community treats as background conditions of urban life. The physicians trained in the Greek tradition are sophisticated within their own framework, but they operate without germ theory, which means the connections between shared bathing and transmission of infection are systematically invisible to them. They treat symptoms with intelligence and care. The causes continue operating. You emerge into the afternoon light, dressed again. The scraping and the warmth have produced a genuine cleanness, a sense of having shed the accumulated weight of the morning. You stand in the street for a moment with this cleanness before the street begins reapplying itself to you, which it begins to do immediately and without apology. The day has moved into its second half. The light is golden and long. You feel, briefly, well. Rome runs on labor the way the aqueducts run on gravity, continuously, invisibly, and in quantities that the people who benefit from it prefer not to examine too directly. The labor is performed by many hands with many legal statuses. The free poor, citizens and non-citizens both, sell their time in the morning markets that gather at the temple steps and the forum corners, where men looking for work and men looking for workers find each other in transactions that are immediate and unregulated and priced by supply and demand in real time. A strong man who can carry things can earn enough for a day's food. A craftsman with a specific skill can earn enough for a day's food and a portion of his rent. A craftsman with a rare skill and a good reputation working within one of the city's collegia. The trade associations that provide something between a guild and a mutual aid society, regulating standards and providing burial insurance and functioning as a social network for practitioners of the same trade, can earn enough to live, not comfortably exactly, but stably. And then there are the enslaved. In first-century Rome, somewhere between 300,000 and 400,000 of the city's million inhabitants are enslaved. One person in 3 approximately whom you pass in the street is someone else's legal property. Not their own person, not possessed of legal standing to refuse work or to leave or to complain to any authority about their condition. This is not a marginal feature of Roman life. It is the foundation of it. The food you eat this morning was grown on farms, staffed largely by enslaved workers. The building you sleep in was constructed by hands that were not free. The water that flows from the fountains came through pipes laid by people who had no choice in the laying. Every comfortable life in Rome, and many uncomfortable ones, rests on this foundation. The work the enslaved do covers everything without exception. Domestic slaves in wealthy households manage correspondence and educate children, and dress the household's members, and prepare food, and serve as the entire operational infrastructure of an upper-class Roman life. Skilled enslaved people work as architects and physicians and accountants and tutors and copyists and artists because the Romans saw no incompatibility between intellectual or creative excellence and enslaved status. A man might depend entirely on someone he legally owned for medical care or literary instruction or financial management, might trust that person with decisions about his own health and wealth, and still regard the fundamental arrangement as natural and correct. The mechanics of the slave market were precise and businesslike. The platform near the Forum of Caesar, where you passed this morning, is one of several such markets operating in the city. And the scene it presents has the orderly commerce of any specialized market conducted by professionals who know their product and their buyers. The enslaved people standing on the raised dais with wooden placards around their necks listing skills: literatus, literate, grammaticus, educated, medicus, medical training, calculator, accounting, faber, craftsman, and origins: Cappadocian, Gallic, Syrian, Greek, Egyptian, and relevant physical qualities noted in the matter-of-fact terminology of men who have described many people this way and intend no particular malice in the describing. The buyers move along the platform with the focused attention of people making significant investments, examining teeth and eyes and muscle tone with the concentrated assessment of knowledge that the stakes require. The price of an educated Greek slave with demonstrated literary skill. The prestige acquisition for a wealthy Roman household that wanted to signal its cultural ambitions could reach into the tens of thousands of sesterces. An unskilled agricultural worker cost considerably less, and the difference in price reflected not only the difference in economic utility, but the difference in the conditions those purchased workers would experience. The unskilled enslaved work the farms and the mines and the quarries and the construction sites in conditions that are physically brutal and frequently fatal, with workloads calibrated to the minimum time it took to exhaust a human body and the maximum output extractable before that happened. The supply from conquest and trade was continuous enough that the calculation could be made this way without threatening the supply. The memory of Spartacus was still alive in the cultural background. The slave revolt of 73 BC that fielded an army of 70,000 and required 3 Roman armies to suppress was 3 or 4 generations past. Close enough that the anxiety it produced was not theoretical, but resident in the institutional memory of every Roman slaveholder, expressed in the laws that required enslaved people to be kept ignorant of their numbers and separated from networks that could coordinate resistance. The household of a wealthy Roman functioned as a kind of corporate entity, and the enslaved people within it formed the structure of that entity in ways that the formal owner-property relationship understates. A senator's household might include a dispensator, an enslaved accountant who managed a household finances with authority over expenditures that exceeded anything a small business owner would trust to an employee. An atriensis supervised the domestic staff the way a manager supervised a team, responsible for the house's physical order and the performance of the people working within it. A cubicularius attended the household's master from before dawn to after dark, managing clothing and schedule and access, one of the most intimate and most influential positions in any wealthy Roman home, precisely because the person who controlled access to the powerful man controlled, to some degree, the powerful man himself. These roles came with authority that extended beyond the household into commercial and political life, because a senator's dispensator, negotiating a grain contract on his behalf, was conducting business with the weight of the senator's fortune and reputation behind him, and the other party to that negotiation treated him accordingly. Rome was not unaware that this system created contradictions. The Stoic philosophers, whose school had been popular among educated Romans for generations, and whose most prominent practitioners included men at the highest social positions, argued that all human beings possessed the same rational faculty and the same divine spark which made any categorical distinction between the enslaved and the free philosophically untenable. Seneca, writing in the 1st century, advised treating enslaved people as human beings rather than tools, eating with them and talking with them and recognizing in them the same capacity for virtue that free-born people claimed for themselves. The advice was not widely followed. The Romans were excellent at holding philosophical positions and continuing to behave in ways the philosophy made difficult to justify, which is perhaps a universally human quality, but which the Romans displayed with a particular combination of sophistication and equanimity. The slave market continued to operate. The Stoics continued to philosophize. The city continued to run on the labor of people who had not chosen to provide it, and the accumulated wealth that made the libraries and the art and the philosophy possible rested on this foundation as completely as the Forum rested on the hills it was built between. The law has opinions about the treatment of enslaved people that are not entirely without substance. It prohibits certain categories of abuse. It allows the accumulation of the peculium, the personal fund that an enslaved person might save, toward the price of self-purchase, which the owner could accept or refuse at will. It provides for manumission through several formal channels and includes the provision, unusual in the ancient world, that manumission produces immediate full Roman citizenship for the freed person. The verni, slaves born within the household, raised from infancy in its rhythms and relationships, were typically treated better than purchased adults, valued for their familiarity, and considered more reliable because they had never known any other home. The distinction between the verna who grew up in your patron's atrium and the Gallic prisoner purchased at auction last year is one of the many gradations within an institution that the Romans thought of as monolithic but experienced in its daily texture as a complex landscape of different conditions and different relationships. You passed the slave market near the Forum of Caesar in the late morning, the platform where men and women and children stand with their placards and the buyers move along with their focused investment attention, and the market operates with the mundane efficiency of any other specialized market in Rome. You walk past it. There is nothing else to do. The craftsmen in the Argiletum are at their workbenches. The book copyists producing the handwritten manuscripts that constitute Rome's publishing industry, the metal workers at their forges, the leather workers at their frames, each absorbed in the specific demands of their particular skill. The book market here is the center of Rome's literary commerce, where the works of Virgil and Horace and Ovid are available in copies produced by trained scribes working from master texts. The literacy rate that makes this market viable is lower than the abundance of inscriptions suggests, but higher than the absence of formal schools implies, because Rome educates in ways that are informal and untracked, as well as formal and recorded, and the city's economic life generates enough demand for functional literacy that it finds ways to supply it. The afternoon cools slightly. The city breathes. The Forum Romanum at midday is something you have to see to understand, and even seeing it, you are not sure you fully understand it. The Roman legal system, which is what the basilicas lining the Forum's south edge are primarily about, courts in session from the morning's 2nd hour until the afternoon's 8th. Handling the continuous flow of civil and criminal business generated by a city of 1 million people, operating under a law code that has been growing in complexity for 4 centuries, is one of the most sophisticated legal structures the ancient world produced. 4 court sessions run simultaneously in the Basilica Julia, separated by wooden screens thin enough to be irrelevant to sound, advocates speaking at the regulated volume and pace of trained rhetoricians, judges sitting at the front of each session with the composed neutrality of men who have done this enough times to have separated the performance of judgment from its substance. The 12 tables, inscribed on bronze in the 5th century before the Common Era and posted publicly so that every citizen could in theory read the law he lived under, are the formal origin of the tradition you are watching operate, though what operates now has grown far beyond them. By the 2nd century, Roman law has developed concepts that will underpin every Western legal system built on its foundations for the next 2,000 years. The presumption of innocence as the starting point of any criminal proceeding, the distinction between civil liability and criminal guilt, the idea that laws should be publicly known and consistently applied, the concept of legal personhood with the rights and capacities that attach to it. The praetor urbanus, the magistrate responsible for civil jurisdiction in the city, issues his edict at the beginning of each year, a public statement of the legal principles he will apply in his court during his term, the types of claims he will hear, and the remedies he will grant. Over generations, the accumulated wisdom of these edicts, refined and carried forward by each successive praetor who found his predecessor's formulations useful, produced the body of praetorian law that sits alongside the formal statutory law and shapes outcomes at least as much. The praetor cannot change the law, but he can decide which claims are actionable in his court. And this power of selection, exercised annually, publicly, and subject to the criticism of the advocates and the jurists whose professional reputation depends on the quality of their legal analysis, is one of the mechanisms by which Roman law updated itself without requiring formal legislative action every time the world changed in ways the old statutes had not anticipated. Being a litigant in the Basilica Julia is an experience that the legal texts do not fully prepare you for. You arrive with your advocate, assuming you have one, which requires either the resources to hire a trained rhetorician or the patronage connection to have one provided. And you wait in the hall with the other parties in other cases and the audience of interested observers who attend court sessions the way a later civilization would attend theatrical performances, with genuine critical investment in the quality of what they are watching. The hall is full and loud and smells of the several hundred people it contains in a space whose ventilation was not designed for this volume of habitation. The speaker in the next court over is delivering a peroration that can be heard clearly through the wooden screen despite the simultaneous proceedings in your own session, because the Basilica Julia, at full operation, is a study in organized acoustic chaos. The advocate speaking in the central court session has studied rhetoric. This is visible in everything about his performance. The long periodic sentences that build to their main clause in the way Cicero demonstrated. The pauses calibrated to allow the audience to register what has just been said. The gestures practiced until they appear spontaneous, the voice modulation that rises to emphasis and falls to intimacy. The Romans were very serious about rhetoric. They taught it systematically in the schools of the Greek tradition transplanted to Rome, and the best advocates were celebrities known by name and followed by reputation and paid accordingly. Cicero, the greatest advocate of the late Republic, was as famous for his speeches in court and in the Senate as for any of his other achievements, and his published speeches circulated as models of the form decades after his death, studied by every student of rhetoric who aspired to work in the basilicas. The legal infrastructure of daily commercial life rested on instruments simple enough for any literate person to use. The stipulatio, the verbal contract performed in the presence of witnesses in which one party asked a question in specific legal form and the other answered in specific legal form, and the exchange created an enforceable obligation, was the workhorse of Roman commercial law, used for loans and sales and promises of service, and dozens of other transactions whose specifics varied, but whose legal structure was always the same careful question and answer. The tabula, the wax tablet writing set, used to record the terms of transactions for later reference, supplemented memory and witness testimony in cases where the terms were complex enough to require documentation. Most Roman commercial relationships operated on the trust generated by these instruments and by the reputational consequences of violating them. Because in a city where everyone knew their neighbor's business and the information about who honored their obligations and who did not circulated freely through the Thermopolia and the baths and the salutatio rooms, the cost of being known as unreliable was a form of punishment that the formal courts were rarely needed to impose. The centum viri, the 100 men, though their actual number varied around that figure in practice, handled the inheritance cases that consumed so much of Roman legal energy, because inheritance in Rome was not merely the transfer of property, but the transfer of social position, the accumulated relationships and obligations and reputation of a household passing to the next generation, or being fought over by claimants whose competing interpretations of the dead person's intentions could produce years of litigation in the basilicas. The great hereditary fortunes of Rome moved through these courts in disputes that were sometimes old enough to have outlasted the children of the original disputants, and sometimes dramatic enough to draw crowds the way gladiatorial matches drew crowds. The stakes were personal and financial and social simultaneously. The advocates hired for the largest cases were the most expensive and the most skilled, and the audiences who packed the Basilica Julia for a major inheritance case were watching a performance in which the whole Roman theory of property and family and succession was being argued out in real time. Pliny the Younger wrote letters about particularly spectacular centumviral cases with the excited detail of someone describing a great theatrical performance, which is what a great legal performance was in Rome to people who had the education to appreciate the technique. Debt was the mechanism by which most ordinary Romans experienced the legal system most directly, because debt was the condition of most ordinary Roman economic life. The moneylenders, the veneratores, who charged interest at rates that the law periodically attempted to regulate and that market reality periodically pushed above the regulated ceiling, occupied a position in the Roman economic landscape that was simultaneously indispensable and despised, the way that any system people cannot function without and do not want to acknowledge needing tends to be regarded. The interest on a loan in Rome could double the principal in a year or less at the rates charged to borrowers without collateral or connection, and the Roman whose bad harvest or illness or unexpected expense had pushed him into debt was in a legal position that had been clarified by the 12 tables and had not been made significantly more comfortable by the centuries of legal development that followed. The creditor's right of recovery was robust. The debtor's right to resist recovery was limited to procedural defenses that required the legal system that required resources to access. This is the circular logic of debt in every era, but Rome's legal machinery made it especially efficient. Legal outcomes in Rome correlate significantly with social position, and nobody is particularly embarrassed about this. The wealthy hire the advocates who know the judges. The jury pools drawn from the equestrian class for the major standing courts are drawn from a population with interests, and those interests shape outcomes in ways not always obvious from the formal record. The poor can, in theory, access the patronage system's legal assistance. One of the things a patron officially provides is help with legal proceedings. But the quality of that assistance depends on the patron's motivation, and a patron is most motivated when the client's case serves the patron's interests. The punishments for those who lose reflect the class of the condemned with a directness the law does not officially acknowledge, but that practice makes consistent. Citizens of status are typically exiled rather than executed for crimes that would carry the death penalty for non-citizens. Exile means loss of citizenship, loss of property, prohibition from Rome. For a senator, effectively the end of everything. The non-citizen condemned to death will be crucified outside the city walls or exposed to animals in the arena, in forms of death chosen partly for their effectiveness and partly for their value as public spectacle. You watch the court session through the Basilica's open side until the advocate reaches his peroration, and you feel the crowd of observers around you respond to it in the way that a crowd responds to good performance. Not quite applause, but a shift in energy, a collective recognition that what they have just heard is well done by the standards they apply to this kind of thing. The judge confers with his assessors. The verdict will come later. You leave the forum through the Arch of Augustus and walk in the afternoon heat toward the Palatine's long shadow, which at this hour provides the closest thing to shade that the city center offers. You have been in Rome long enough to feel this rhythm in your body. The city has made you its own, which is what Rome does to everyone who stays long enough. 50,000 people can sit in the Colosseum. This is a number that requires a moment to inhabit. 50,000 people is the entire population of a substantial Roman provincial city, compressed into a single structure in the center of Rome on the days of the games, and on those days they are all present, and they are all watching the same thing, and they are all responding to it simultaneously, and the sound of 50,000 people responding to the same event in the same moment is a sound you feel in your chest before you hear it with your ears. A deep collective pressure that the architecture of the building amplifies and focuses in ways that its engineers understood from acoustics as well as spectacle. The Colosseum itself, the Flavian Amphitheater as its builders called it, was begun by Vespasian on the ground of Nero's private lake, and completed and inaugurated by Titus in AD 80, a pointed political act of returning to the Roman people what a hated emperor had taken for private use. The inaugural games lasted 100 days and reportedly involved 9,000 animals and an unknown number of human beings. And the crowd that watched them occupied tiers of seats organized by social status. Marble seats in the front sections for senators and the Vestal Virgins and the imperial box. Stone seats in the middle sections for the equestrian class and the citizens of various grades. Wooden benches in the highest tiers for the poorer citizens and the women. And standing room at the very top for those who had no assigned seat and were willing to stand for hours in the sun. The velarium, the vast canvas awning that shades the spectators from the afternoon sun, is deployed by sailors of the Misenum fleet who have been seconded to Rome for the specific and specialized purpose of operating the rigging system that supports and adjusts it. The logistics of 50,000 people entering and exiting a single structure, solved by the numbered vomitoria, the 80 arched entrances that allowed crowds to fill and empty the building in impressively short times, reflect the same organizational intelligence that built the aqueducts and the road network and the military camps. The day begins with the Pampa. Before any blood is shed, before any animal is released, or any gladiator steps onto the sand, the procession enters. The editor, the man whose name and wealth and political ambition are funding today's games, rides in an ivory chariot through the main gate, preceded by musicians whose instruments include the long curved lichus and the enormous straight tuba, whose sound carries to the highest tiers without effort, and followed by the gladiators themselves, walking in their armor, weapons not yet drawn, their faces visible to the crowd in the morning light before the helmets go on. The crowd responds to specific faces, the well-known fighters, the men whose records are followed and whose names are written on the walls of the city, in graffiti that serves as a kind of popular sports commentary. And the response is the roar of recognition, 50,000 people simultaneously identifying someone they have been anticipating. The Pampa establishes the scale of the event. It says, what you are about to see is worth this ceremony. The arena floor is sand, harina, from which the word arena is derived, and it is pale and deep enough to absorb what the day will produce. Beneath it, invisible to the crowd, the hypogum operates, the underground network of corridors and cages and mechanical lifts that can raise animals through trapdoors in the arena floor with a theatrical suddenness that the crowd finds reliably entertaining. The engineers who designed the hypogum understood spectacle the way they understood aqueducts, as a problem of logistics and timing, of getting the right thing to the right place at the right moment, of ensuring that the system was reliable enough to not fail in front of 50,000 people who had been promised something specific. The morning session is the venatio, the wild beast hunt. The animals come from the farthest reaches of the empire. Lions from sub-Saharan Africa, transported in cages on ships and then overland to Rome. Bears from the forests of northern Europe. Crocodiles from the Nile. Rhinoceroses, elephants, the full catalog of the empire's zoological reach, all transported alive to Rome and held in the animal enclosures beneath the arena floor until the moment of their appearance. The smell of the arena during the venatio is specific and memorable. The hot sand and the animal musk of creatures that have been confined too long and are simultaneously frightened and enraged. And beneath it the clean iron smell of blood that the morning sun warms into something that becomes, over the course of the day, simply the smell of the Colosseum. The midday interval between the morning venatio and the afternoon gladiatorial combat was used for executions. The noxii, criminals condemned by courts to die in the arena, were brought into the arena and killed, sometimes by animals and sometimes by each other in forced combat, in spectacles whose theatrical framing ranged from the minimal to the elaborate. This was not the main event. It was the intermission understood by the crowd to be the intermission, and a significant portion of the audience took this opportunity to leave for food and to return before the afternoon session. The gladiators arrive in the afternoon. They are professionals, athletes trained for years in specialized schools called ludi, under experienced coaches, fed diets calibrated to build the specific physique their fighting style requires, and matched against opponents whose equipment and techniques complement theirs in pairings specified by traditional rules that the crowd knows well. A Murmillo, with his large rectangular shield and his gladius, is matched against a Thraex, with his small curved shield and his Psyche. A Retiarius, with his net and his trident, is matched against a Secutor whose smooth helmet is specifically designed so that the net cannot catch on it. The pairings are old and conventional and meaningful to the audience, which watches with the critical eye of spectators who understand the rules and can identify when a fighter is deviating from them in ways that suggest either desperation or strategy. The betting began before the games and has been running continuously since. The organized bookmakers who work the upper tiers accept wagers on individual bouts, not just on the outcome, but on the manner of it, the specific weapons used, the duration, whether missio will be granted. The information that shapes these wagers circulates through the ludus and the bathhouses and the barbers' shops in the days leading up to the games. A secondary economy of specialized knowledge about a gladiator's recent form and current health and the opponent he has been matched against. And the men who gather and sell this information are as much a part of the games as the fighters themselves. From the upper wooden benches where you are sitting, the arena below has a different quality than from the front seats. The senators in the marble sections can read the fighters' expressions, can see the sweat and the effort and the specific geometry of each moment's exchange up close. From the upper tiers, you see the pattern, the whole choreography of the bout, the way one fighter's strategy develops over several exchanges, the way an advantage builds slowly through a series of small decisions. You can hear the crowd around you reacting to things you can fully see and things you can only partially see. The people in the better seats responding first because they see things first, and the response cascading upward through the tiers like a wave. The collective intelligence of 50,000 people watching the same thing simultaneously produces interpretations that no individual watching alone could reach. The crowd knows things the crowd cannot fully articulate, and what the crowd knows about gladiatorial combat after generations of watching it is considerable. Most gladiatorial combats end not in death but in surrender. The defeated fighter signals submission, and the crowd and the editor decide whether to grant missio, the mercy that allows the loser to leave the arena alive. The factors in this decision are not simple. A fighter who has shown skill and courage despite losing earns better odds than one who has fought poorly. A fighter with a long history of victories who has built a following is worth more to his school alive than dead. The missio is granted more often than the myth suggests, and the gladiators who survive long careers accumulate prize money and gifts from wealthy fans that can, in time, purchase their freedom from the contract that bound them to the arena. You watch the final bout of the afternoon from the upper tiers, and when it ends and the winner raises his arm, and the crowd releases the accumulated tension of the session in the particular sound of a large crowd satisfied, you find yourself standing with everyone else, which is what you do at the games, which is what 50,000 people do at the games, which is what the games are for. After the final bout and the crowd's release of the afternoon's accumulated tension, The city pours out through the vomitoria in the organized flow of 50,000 people who all want to be somewhere else and who have learned, through the experience of previous games, to move efficiently through the narrow arched exits. The games do not end when the last gladiator lowers his weapon. They continue in the Thermopolia and the Papanai, and the street corners for the rest of the evening, in the arguments about the afternoon's decisions, whether the missio granted in the third bout was warranted, whether the murmillo in the fifth bout was fighting with an injury he had concealed from the doctors who cleared him, and in the retelling and the betting settlement and the formation of opinions about who to watch at the next games, which the editor of that event is already planning based on the size and enthusiasm of the crowd he has just watched leave. The games create the next games. The conversation they produce is part of what they produce. You carry a piece of the afternoon with you into the evening, the specific quality of attention that watching skilled people do dangerous things in public leaves in the body, something between alertness and wonder that the city's ordinary noise has not yet quite displaced. Every Roman lives inside a conversation with the gods. This is not a figure of speech. It is the literal structure of daily life in a city where the sacred and the practical are not separate categories, but aspects of the same continuous existence. The gods of Rome are present in the household and in the street and in the weather and in the outcome of this morning's business and in the health of the children and in the quality of the harvest. And they are consulted before significant actions and thanked after successful ones, and the consultation is not private devotion, but public, regulated, institutionalized practice maintained by the full apparatus of the state. The Roman approach to religion operates on a principle as old as commerce. Do ut des. I give that you may give. The gods are not worshipped in the sense of personal devotion toward a transcendent power. They are honored in the sense of maintaining a transactional relationship with beings who have influence over the domains of life you care about, and the maintenance of this relationship requires correct observance of the forms, accurate performance of the rituals, and the provision of appropriate offerings. A Roman who has made a vow to Jupiter Optimus Maximus in exchange for success in some endeavor is not more pious than his neighbor if he fails to fulfill that vow on success. He is simply foolish because the gods keep records, and so does everyone else, and a man who does not honor his vows to the gods is a man who does not honor his vows at all. At the entrance to your insula, there is a lararium, a shrine built into the wall, painted with images of the lares compitals, the guardian spirits of the neighborhood crossroads, and the genius of the current household head, or of the building itself. Someone places a token offering each morning, a pinch of grain or a small cake or a few drops of wine. And the lares receive it, and the relationship between the inhabitants and whatever forces preside over the continued standing of poorly constructed buildings is maintained through this daily transaction that costs almost nothing and may cost everything if it is omitted. The paterfamilias of any proper household maintains a more elaborate lararium inside the home, conducting daily observances at the shrines of the lares familiares, the household's specific protecting spirits, whose continued goodwill is considered as essential to the household's welfare as the roof overhead, or the food in the storage jars. The major religious institutions of Rome are administered by the state with the same seriousness it brings to the management of the water supply or the army. The pontifices, a college of priests whose oversight extends to the Roman religious calendar, the correct form of sacrifices and prayers, and the interpretation of portents, maintain a body of specialized knowledge accumulated over centuries. The augurs read the flight of birds and the feeding behavior of sacred chickens and translate their observations into interpretations of divine favor or disfavor. The practice is old enough that nobody remembers it beginning, and it is embedded deep enough in Roman institutional life that even the Romans who find it intellectually unconvincing continue to observe its forms, because the forms are required by the law, and because a consul who consults augurs before a major decision, and then the decision goes badly wrong, can claim that the gods warned him and he was overruled, whereas a consul who skips the augury and the decision goes badly wrong has only himself to blame. The sacrificial system is continuous and everywhere. Every significant public act, the opening of the Senate, the departure of an army, the dedication of a new building, the beginning of a magistrate's term, is preceded by sacrifice. The animal is selected, decorated with ribbons and gilded horns if the occasion calls for it, led to the altar by attendants trained in the specific choreography the ritual requires. The flute plays to cover any words of ill omen spoken in the crowd. The haruspice examines the entrails. The liver above all, that organ whose lobes and markings the Etruscan tradition had mapped into a system of interpretation as detailed and as internally consistent as any diagnostic system, proceeding from a universe in which the microcosm reflects the macrocosm, and the state of the sacrificed animal's organs reveals the state of the divine attention currently directed at the matter at hand. An unfavorable liver requires another sacrifice. Two unfavorable livers in succession require postponement of whatever was proposed. The system has its own momentum and its own logic, and it has been operating continuously since before anyone living can remember. The temples are everywhere, and they are busy. The Temple of Saturn at the base of the Capitoline holds the state treasury in its podium. The Temple of Castor and Pollux serves as the official weights and measures standard. The Temple of Vesta houses the eternal flame and the 6 Vestals, whose 30-year term of service and extraordinary legal privileges and extraordinary punishment for violation of their vow of chastity, which was burial alive in the Campus Sceleratus, make them among the most anomalous and powerful figures in Roman public religion. A Vestal who intercedes with a magistrate for a condemned man exercises a kind of spiritual authority that the Romans accept as entirely real, because the Vestal's purity maintains the purity of the flame, maintains the continuity of Rome, maintains the order of the world, and this is a chain of connection that the Romans take literally rather than metaphorically. Beyond the official religion there are the others. Isis, the Egyptian goddess, has temples throughout Rome and a devoted following that cuts across social classes. The mystery religion she represents, with its rituals of initiation and its promise of personal transformation and divine protection, provides something the official Roman pantheon does not. A personal relationship with a divine being who knows your name and cares about your specific fate. The Isis cult has been suppressed periodically and tolerated periodically, and it keeps returning because it answers a need that suppression does not address, the need to be personally known by a god, rather than simply correctly observed by one. The Roman understanding of what happens after death is less settled than the official religion's confident surface suggests. The underworld exists, the kingdom of Dis, through which the Styx runs and on which Charon poles his ferry, and for whose passage the coin placed on or in the mouth of the dead is intended. The shades of the dead persist in some attenuated form in the Elysian fields, if they were good, and in Tartarus, if they were not. But the texture of this persistence is not clearly defined, and different Roman authors describe it differently, and the Romans who think about it seriously tend to conclude that virtuous conduct in life is preferable to its opposite on the chance that it matters, even if they cannot commit with full confidence to the specifics of why. The mystery cults, Isis, Mithras, the various initiatory traditions that offer their members specific knowledge of the divine and specific promise of favorable afterlife treatment, are popular partly because they offer a more detailed and personally addressed answer to the question of what death actually produces. Mithras, a god of uncertain origin worshipped in underground rooms called Mithraea throughout Rome and the Empire, is particularly popular among soldiers and merchants, communities that move, that form intense bonds of loyalty, that find in a god associated with cosmic combat and personal ordeal something useful for understanding their own lives. The Mithraic communities are small and secretive in the sense of having initiatory stages that non-members do not participate in, and they meet in spaces that are physically underground, cool and dim and smelling of the sacrificial meat that the ritual meals involve, and the sense of belonging they create is intense in proportion to their exclusivity. The Roman approach to death was, like the Roman approach to most things, organized and practical and inhabited with genuine feeling that the organization did not quite contain. The funeral of a person of standing was a public event, the body processed through the city streets on a bier accompanied by hired mourners. The praeficae, professional women whose job was to produce the correct volume and quality of grief, regardless of their personal relationship to the deceased, and by actors wearing the wax imagines of the family's ancestors, the dead making a procession through the city, attended by the visible record of everyone who had died before them. The corpse was burned on a pyre outside the city walls. Burial within the walls was prohibited, which is why the roads out of Rome were lined with tombs. The ashes collected into an urn, and the urn placed in a tomb whose scale and decoration communicated the social position of its occupant to everyone who passed on the road for the next several centuries. The tombstone inscriptions that survive in their thousands speak in the first person. I was Marcus. I lived 42 years. I was not here and was happy. Now I am here and am not. In a voice that is remarkably direct across 2,000 years, the dead speak into the living with the particular urgency of people who want to be remembered and know that memory is the only continuity available to them. The phrase that appears on Roman tombs more frequently than any other is simple to the point of brutality. Non fui, fui, non sum, non curo. I was not, I was, I am not, I do not care. The Romans were capable of this, and they were also capable of spending enormous sums on elaborate funerary monuments. Both were true simultaneously, which is perhaps the most Roman thing about them. And the Christians are in Rome. Their numbers are small, and their community is not yet visible as a distinct entity to the average Roman pedestrian. They meet in private houses, in apartment rooms, in the kind of spaces you sleep and eat in, and they conduct rituals that will eventually transform the religious landscape of everything Rome touches. And the city in which they meet is almost entirely unaware of what is developing in its midst. You pass the Temple of Jupiter on the Capitoline as the evening sacrifice is performed, the smoke rising, the priests reading when they find with the focused attention of trained practitioners. The sky receives it. The city continues, sustained by its daily accounting with the divine. The Roman soldier posted at the guard station on the Via Appia, outside the Capena gate, has been in the army for 14 years. He enlisted at 17 from a town in northern Italy whose name would not appear in any history text you could name, because the family farm was insufficient to support 2 sons, and the army was what the younger son did when there was nothing else to do, and enough health and height and disposition to pass the recruiting officer's inspection. The inspection was thorough. The military required men within a specific height range, with no disqualifying physical defects, able to demonstrate the stamina that the initial training would demand, and ideally from the propertied classes whose stake in the empire's continued operation was considered a useful motivator. Though this last criterion had been relaxing since the Marian reforms of the late Republic removed the property qualification entirely and opened the legions to all Roman citizens regardless of wealth. He has been posted to the Rhine frontier and to the Judean province and to his current assignment near Rome, which is not prestigious, but which is safe. The legionaries' day on campaign began before dawn. The buccina, the military horn, sounded in the darkness, and the contubernium, the 8-man tent group that was the army's basic social unit, rose and packed and armed in the specific sequence they had practiced until it was automatic. Each man carried approximately 40 kilograms of equipment, weapons, armor, tools, rations, the personal kit, the pack organized on the T-shaped furca that distributed the weight in the most bearable configuration, and the column moved at the regulated pace of about 25 miles per day. A pace that was designed not to exhaust the men, but to maintain the conditioning that the campaigning season required. The legionary who fell behind on the march faced punishment of the caliber that the centurion with his vine staff administered without consultation and without appeal. And the centurion carried his authority absolutely, because the alternative, an army that fell behind on its marches, was an army that lost campaigns. The pay is regular, which matters more than its amount. 14 denarii per month, before deductions for food and equipment and contributions to the burial fund that provides the military funeral and the memorial that every soldier wants. Not because the amount is generous, though it is sufficient, but because in an economy where reliability of income is not universal, a guaranteed payment at a guaranteed interval on a guaranteed day is a form of wealth that compounds over time into something resembling security. The retirement grant, land in a veteran colony or its cash equivalent, provided at honorable discharge after 25 years of service, is the goal that organizes everything else, the future that makes the present disciplined. The organization of the Legion is precise and purposeful. 10 cohorts, each of 6 centuries, each century nominally 80 men under a centurion whose position is the backbone of the Roman military structure. Not a general, not a politician, but a professional military officer of the middle grade, whose authority over his century is total, and whose experience in the field is the aggregate of everything the army has learned about what works and what doesn't. The first cohort was the most prestigious double strength at 800 men and composed of the most experienced soldiers, stationed at the central position in battle formation where the outcome was most often decided. The centurions of the first cohort were the men whose careers in the army had demonstrated the combination of physical endurance, tactical judgment, personal authority, and sheer longevity that the position required, and their salary was accordingly higher than that of ordinary legionaries. In some grades dramatically so, the primus pilus, first centurion of the first cohort, earning roughly 60 times what the ordinary soldier received. The religious dimension of the Roman army was as precisely organized as its tactical structure. Each century carried its standard, the signum, a pole topped with an image of the cohort's identifying device, crowned with a hand or a wreath, or the animal associated with the unit's history. Each legion carried the aquila, the eagle, made of gold or gilt bronze, mounted on a pole, the object whose preservation in battle took absolute priority over everything except the emperor's person. To lose the aquila was a catastrophe of a kind that could not be recovered from without a campaign specifically devoted to its recovery. The disaster of Varus in the Teutoburg forest in 9 AD, where 3 legions were destroyed and their eagles captured, produced a humiliation that Augustus reportedly muttered over for years, and that was not fully addressed until Germanicus recovered the last of the 3 eagles nearly a decade later. The standards were not merely organizational markers. They were sacred objects kept in a shrine in the camp and treated with the ritual respect of religious artifacts, because the Roman army's discipline and its supernatural protection were intertwined in ways the soldiers experienced as entirely real, and that the officers who managed those soldiers had learned not to dismiss as superstition, because belief maintained under pressure was worth as much as any other tactical asset. The medical organization of the Roman military was remarkably sophisticated by ancient standards, a consequence of the army's practical interest in keeping its trained soldiers functional rather than any abstract commitment to their welfare. Each legion included a medical staff, the capsari, who provided immediate battlefield first aid, the medici, who handled the more complicated interventions, and the valetudinarium, the hospital that every permanent camp included as a standard feature, sited on a drainage slope away from the water supply in the empirically observed practice that reduced infection rates, that the germ theory these practitioners did not possess could not have explained. The Romans did not understand why injured soldiers treated in the valetudinarium survived at higher rates than those who were not, but they had observed the pattern across enough campaigns to have institutionalized the practice of building the hospital first. Surgical instruments recovered from Roman military sites, probes and scalpels and forceps and bone drills whose design is familiar to any modern surgical technician, reveal a level of practical medical sophistication that the absence of anesthetic made heroic in ways that the physicians who performed the procedures understood in real time and the patients experienced in specific and unambiguous detail. The army also builds things, and this is not incidental to its military function, but central to it. A Roman military camp constructed on campaign was not a temporary bivouac, but a fortified installation built to a standard plan every time, regardless of terrain or available time. the Via Principalis running through the middle, the Praetorium command complex at the center, the granaries and the armories and the hospital, and the stables arranged in their prescribed positions around it, the whole surrounded by ditch and rampart, built by the soldiers themselves in the hours after a day's march. The discipline of this construction, every man knowing his assigned task in the camp-building sequence, every unit responsible for its section of the perimeter, was the same discipline that made Roman armies difficult to surprise and nearly impossible to destroy in the field. An army that builds its own fortified camp every night, an army that can always retreat to a position of strength, and this fact shaped the tactical options of Rome's enemies in ways that compounded across generations. The road network that connects the empire, without which supply lines cannot function, without which armies cannot move, without which the administrative authority of Rome cannot reach the provinces, was built by legionaries in the periods between campaigns, the same men who fight building the physical infrastructure that makes the fighting possible and sustainable. The roads are built with a consistency of engineering that reflects the same institutional knowledge as the camps. A drainage ditch on each side, a gravel sub-base compacted in layers, a surface course of fitted stone or gravel depending on the region's available materials, and a width sufficient to allow two carts to pass in opposite directions simultaneously. The roads are not merely transport infrastructure, they are political statements, each one announcing that Rome has arrived in this place and intends to stay, and that the staying will require movement in both directions, between here and the center of everything. The Praetorian Guard has the best assignment in the Roman army, and everyone in the legions knows it. 9 cohorts in Rome, paid 3 times the legionary rate, serving 16 years rather than 25, stationed in the capital in proximity to the emperor whose person they formally protect. The emperors created the Guard as a personal protection force and discovered that a concentrated armed force in the capital with loyalty directed at an individual rather than an institution creates, over time, a political actor whose interests cannot be ignored. Praetorian prefects have made and unmade emperors. The Guard has decided succession. The relationship between the imperial power and the force created to protect it has been, from the beginning, more complicated than the title suggests. The auxiliary units, the non-citizen troops recruited from throughout the empire's provinces, Gallic cavalry and Syrian archers and Numidian light infantry and Batavian swimmers and the 100 other specialist capabilities that the Roman military system absorbed and deployed, received lower pay than legionaries and served longer terms, but received Roman citizenship on honorable discharge, which was a transformation of legal status significant enough to motivate the service that earned it. The diploma, the bronze certificate issued to each discharged auxiliary recording his name and unit, and years of service and the grant of citizenship and the right of legal marriage, was the most important document most of these men ever possessed, and the care with which the surviving examples were kept and preserved suggests the weight they carried. The soldier at the gate watches the Via Appia in the evening light, the road that has been entering Rome from the south for 4 centuries, lined on both sides outside the city walls with the tombs of the people who could afford to be buried on Rome's most prestigious road. The tombs are elaborate and continuous for miles, a museum of Roman ambition displayed in the medium of funerary architecture. and behind them the Campagna stretches south in the softening light of late afternoon, flat and familiar, and smelling of the particular combination of dust and vegetation and distant water that is the smell of the Roman countryside in the warm months. He has 3 years left. He has been calculating the land grant for 2 of them. The light goes out of Rome slowly. It begins in the east, where the higher buildings on the Esquiline and the Viminal cast long shadows that move across the valley floors as the sun descends, and then across the Forum as the Palatine takes the sun, and then across the Tiberside neighborhoods as the Janiculum catches the last of the west, and Rome transitions from the golden afternoon to the bluish dusk to the particular dark of a city that has no electrical substitution for daylight, no gas, no arc lamp, nothing between the human eye and the absence of the sun except whatever fire people choose to carry. There is fire which is not the same as light. Torches burn at the doorways of wealthy houses and at the entrances of temples and at the guard posts around the city's significant points. The tabernae and the popinae that stay open into the evening, the wine bars and the food stalls whose customers want food and company after dark, hang oil lamps on their door frames and set them on their counters. And the small warm circles of orange light they produce are enough to conduct business by and enough to see the faces of the people you are talking to, which is most of what light is needed for in a conversation. Between the points of light there is darkness, genuine darkness, the darkness of an ancient city. And in the streets of the Subura, the space between torches is the kind that makes familiar things look like other things. The popinae are Rome's night rooms. The wine bars that stay open after dark are not the establishments where respectable Romans are admitted in daylight. They are the places where the social hierarchy's lower tiers extend the day, past the point where the Thermopolia have served their last customer, and the patronage visits have been conducted, and the obligations of daylight Rome have been discharged. The Popina on the corner 2 streets from your building serves cheap wine from amphorae that are refilled from wherever the cheapest source is, and it serves olives and simple food from a counter that has been in continuous operation since before anyone in the neighborhood can remember, and its clientele at any given evening hour includes the full cross-section of the Subura's lower half. Porters and freedmen, and the occasional soldier, and the people whose occupation the polite daylight hours prefer not to examine. The dice games that technically violate the Roman law, restricting gambling to certain festival periods, operate here with the confident invisibility of enterprises that know the relevant officials and have already reached the relevant arrangements. The conversations are louder than daylight conversations, the wine being its own logic, and the laughter that comes through the open front of the Popina into the evening street has the particular edge of people who have worked hard all day and are working equally hard at not thinking about tomorrow. The wagons start almost immediately after full dark. You hear them before the full dark has settled. The first one coming down the Via Suburana from the direction of the warehouses, its wheels striking the basalt road surface with a rhythm that is neither musical nor mechanical, but something in between, a sound that carries clearly through the evening air. Then another from a different direction. Then several, overlapping, the particular acoustic signature of a city that has released its freight traffic all at once after holding it through the entire day. The drivers shout in the way of Roman cart drivers, a combination of command and warning and the specific insult vocabulary developed by people who operate heavy vehicles in narrow streets and have strong feelings about anyone who fails to move out of the way quickly enough. And the sound of their voices adds to the wheels, adds to the hoofbeats, and the whole accumulating noise of night. Rome begins to fill the streets and through the walls and into the rooms where people are trying to sleep. No one sleeps easily in Rome. This is not a figure of speech. The satirist Juvenal, writing about the conditions of life in the city, was explicit. The wagon traffic alone was enough to deny sleep to anyone who could not afford a house with thick walls in a quiet neighborhood, which was almost no one, and the wagon traffic was supplemented by the shouting of the drivers and the disputes of the drunk and the crying of the infants in the adjacent rooms, and the sound of the building itself, which old buildings make sounds like, and all of this was simply the acoustic texture of Roman nights, accepted as the cost of living in Rome. You have been told by people who have visited other cities, Alexandria, Antioch, Carthage, that those cities also have noise at night, and you believe them, but you notice they still came back. The criminal economy of the night streets is real and known. The pickpockets work the crowds near the torchlit tabernae. The footpads work the darker stretches of road between the light sources. The organized thieves work the bathing houses and the wealthy households whose slaves can be bribed or distracted, and the disorganized violence of men drunk on cheap wine works wherever it happens to encounter someone smaller or more isolated than itself. The vigils, 7 cohorts, roughly 7,000 men, are primarily fire watchers, and their criminal deterrence is performed with less organization and less success than their fire watching. And the consequence is that the nighttime city below the threshold at which you can afford a torch carrier is genuinely dangerous. The Forum at 3 in the morning is a different city. The great public space that at midday holds the weight of empire. The court sessions and the commercial dealings and the political maneuvering and the crowds navigating between all three lies empty under the stars in the small hours, the columns white in the moonlight when there is moon, darker shapes against darker sky when there is not. The homeless sleep in the porticos of the basilicas, wrapped in what they have, and the water sellers who work through the night make their rounds of the fountains, filling and selling, their calls low enough not to wake those sleeping nearby, but audible enough to carry to anyone awake and thirsty. The Forum at 3 in the morning is as close as Rome ever comes to quiet. And even here, it is not quite quiet because the wagons are still on the roads beyond the Forum's edges, and the city is still breathing in its million-person way, and the permanent low hum of an organism this large and this continuous does not fully stop at any hour of any night. You are inside your room before the first hour of the night is fully underway. You have locked the door with the latch and placed the sandals near the bed in the dark, and you are lying in the heat that the building has stored from the day and is releasing now into the night. The stone walls warm against the outside of your hand when you press it there. The wagons are audible through the window shutters. They will be audible for the next 6 hours without pause. You think about Rome in the dark and the noise. You think about the million people who are in this city tonight, in rooms like yours and in rooms nothing like yours. In the marble-floored reception halls of the palatial houses on the Aventine, and in the overcrowded single rooms of the Subura, and in the barracks of the Praetorian Guard, and in the cells of the ludus, where the gladiators are reviewed before tomorrow's possible appearance, in the arena, and in the homes of the freedmen who have made something from nothing, and in the houses of the senators whose certainty about the importance of their own judgments has shaped the laws you live under. 1,000,000 people in the same city tonight, under the same sky, breathing the same air that smells of the same fires and the same drains, and the same 1,000,000 lives, all conducting themselves simultaneously in the same square miles of hills and valleys on the banks of the same river. And you think about what they built, not the monuments, though the monuments are extraordinary, and you have seen enough of them by now to understand why people have been traveling to Rome to see them for 2,000 years. The aqueducts and the roads and the Colosseum and the Forum and the temple facades with their colonnades and their inscribed dedications and the triumphal arches commemorating victories over people who are now incorporated into the empire that those victories built. These things are real and they are impressive, and they will stand for much longer than the people who built them will live. But also the other things. The Thermopolium that fed you this morning with something warm despite the absence of a kitchen in your building. The patronage system that gave you a small sum of coins and the knowledge that someone in the city knows your name and can be appealed to. The law that is imperfect and biased and administered by people with interests, but that exists and is public and applies to everyone in principle and to many people in practice. The baths that are open to everyone and are free, and that provide, for the price of an afternoon's time, an experience of physical comfort and social contact that the private wealth of the wealthy cannot make significantly better. A civilization is not its monuments. It is the daily life of its 1,000,000 people, the arrangements they make with each other for food and water and shelter and dispute resolution, and the management of violence and the provision of meaning. Rome arranged these things imperfectly, unequally, with the structural brutality of a society that considered a third of its population to be property, and the remaining population to be arranged in a hierarchy of worth from the emperor at the top to the free poor at the bottom who owned their freedom and very little else. It arranged them with lead pipes and contested grain supplies and buildings that caught fire and streets that had no lights at night. It arranged them with garum and aqueducts and the greatest legal system its world had ever produced, and a literary tradition that the people who came after it spent 2,000 years trying to equal. This is always the paradox of Rome, not the paradox of the powerful and the poor, which is the paradox of every civilization, the paradox of a place that knew, in some way, that it was doing extraordinary things and ordinary terrible things simultaneously, and kept doing both, and could not or would not resolve the contradiction, and lasted 500 years anyway. Sometime before dawn, the wagons thin, not all at once. There is no moment at which the city's night commerce stops, only a gradual reduction in the frequency of the sounds, the intervals between wheels growing longer, the shouting of the drivers becoming less continuous and more occasional. The first suggestion of dawn is not light, but the return of the bread smell. The bakeries that have been running their ovens through the night are producing their first loaves of the new day, and the smell of baking bread that drifted through the pre-dawn darkness last night drifts again now. The same smell coming from the same ovens on the same streets for reasons the baker's grandfather's grandfathers could have stated without difficulty, because bread in Rome is made at night and smelled in the approaching dawn and sold at first light, and this is how it has been done and how it will continue to be done. Then the birds. The sparrows that have always nested in the masonry of the Insulae and the temples and the market stalls come into voice in the few minutes before the light is visible, the way birds everywhere announce the day before the day is technically present, and the sparrows of Rome do this in the particular way of birds that have been doing it in the same buildings for the length of the city's life, which is a very long time for sparrows to have been doing anything. The light returns to the city the way the wagons left it, gradually, incrementally, the gray becoming blue, becoming gold. And Rome comes back to itself out of the night the way it always does, unchanged in its essential character from what it was when the dark arrived. Still a million people, still conducting a million lives inside the same impossible and magnificent and dangerous arrangement of stone and water and law and labor and faith that has been their world for as long as anyone has known anything. The wagon passes beneath your window. The building sighs in the way it always sighs. The heat in the stone walls begins, very slowly, to diminish. Rome does not sleep, but you do? Eventually, beneath the noise and the heat and the smell of a million people living in a rented room 3 floors above a street that has not been cleaned in days, in the most powerful city in the history of the world, in the middle of a civilization that was simultaneously the greatest thing human beings had yet produced, and the most dangerous place most of them had ever lived. You close your eyes, and Rome carries on around you, as it always has, as it always will, loud and dangerous and magnificent and brutal and alive, the city that poisoned its own water and wrote the foundations of Western law, the city that fed its poor through a grain dole and enslaved 1/3 of its population, the city that built roads that lasted 2,000 years and apartment buildings that collapsed in 20, the city of 1 million people who got up every morning and ate their porridge and went out into the noise and somehow, day after day, century after century, found a way to live. That was Rome. That is always Rome. Settle in. Close your eyes. You already know how this ends.